Welcome to Australian Crime Stories. Follow us on your listening platform and social media to stay up to date. You can also join the Ned Kelly Gang for early access to ad-free episodes and exclusive content. In April 2002, a well-known Melbourne couple vanished without a trace after a quiet family dinner in the affluent suburb of Glen Iris. Their disappearance would spark a major police investigation, drawing in detectives, media, and a stunned public. What began as a missing persons case quickly revealed itself to be a double homicide. Uncover the dark corners of this unique country with our next chapter, the Society Murders. This is Australian Crime Stories. April 8th, 2002. When the missing persons report for Margaret Wales King, 69, and her husband Paul King, 75, came through on Monday, it didn't immediately trigger alarm bells. It was filed by Margaret's daughter, Emma Wales, who told police that she hadn't heard from her mother since Thursday night, April 4th. Margaret and Paul had gone to dinner at the Glen Iris home of Margaret's son Matthew Wales and his wife Maritza before leaving around 10 p.m. that evening. Since then, nothing. At first glance, the case appeared like a curious but not uncommon disappearance. But within the homicide squad, seasoned detectives were already paying close attention. These were not the kind of people who just vanished. Margaret Wales King came from the influential and wealthy Wales family, well known in Melbourne's social circles, with deep roots and a high public profile. Paul King, a retired academic and scientist, lived a quiet life. The couple was, by all accounts, settled and predictable. They had no known travel plans, and Margaret in particular was described by family as punctual, communicative, and responsible. She never went anywhere without letting someone know. April 9th. By Tuesday, the case had begun to shift. What had initially been treated as an unusual absence was now becoming deeply concerning. Detectives noted that there had been no phone activity from either Margaret or Paul since the night of April 4th. Their bank accounts remained untouched. No transactions, no cash withdrawals. At their Melbourne home, everything was exactly as it had been left. Newspapers and mail had begun to collect at the front door, untouched, the first visible signs that something wasn't right. Most troubling of all, the couple's silver Mercedes-Benz C180, registration plate PJK505, was still missing. With each unanswered question, the sense of unease grew. Something was wrong, and whatever had happened to Margaret and Paul, it hadn't been voluntary. Detective Charlie Bazina, a veteran of the squad, was assigned to the case alongside Detective Inspector Andrew Allen, who would oversee the investigation. Bazina began by conducting background checks and interviews with family members. Among the first was Matthew Wales, the last person to see the couple alive. Wales cooperated. He answered questions calmly, providing details of the dinner that night, what was served, when they arrived, when they left. But to Bazina, something felt off.
He was flat, unemotional. It wasn't what you'd expect from someone whose mother and stepfather had vanished.
April 10th. The interviews began in earnest. First in was Emma Wales, Margaret's daughter and the one who had filed the missing persons report. Emma appeared distressed and confused. She spoke about how out of character her mother's disappearance was, how Margaret was punctual, predictable, and would never leave without contacting her children. Emma's concern was genuine, and so were her suspicions. She told police her mother and Matthew had a complicated relationship. There had been tension over money, inheritance, and control. Matthew, she said, had always struggled, financially and emotionally, and often felt overlooked in the family hierarchy. Bazina took note. That tension was a pressure point. Next was Maritza Wales, Matthew's wife. Maritza was polite, respectful, but clearly uncomfortable. Her answers were short. She confirmed the couple had come over for dinner that night and left around 10 p.m. Detectives pressed her gently but persistently. Could she describe what was served, what they talked about, what Margaret was wearing? She fumbled. The timing of the guest's departure was uncertain, the details hazy. There were no clear explanations for how or when the couple left, whether they had seemed ill or why Matthew didn't follow up when his mother and stepfather never made it home. Maritza maintained her story, but it was thin.
Want more Australian stories? Become a Kelly Gang member and get early access to ad-free episodes and bonus content. Start your free trial today.
Then came a critical development. Police received a call from a resident in Middle Park, a quiet suburb more than 20 kilometres from Glen Iris. A silver Mercedes-Benz had been sitting parked on the same street for several days without moving. Something about it didn't sit right with the locals. Patrol officers were dispatched. The registration, PJK 505, confirmed it. This was Margaret and Paul's car. Its condition raised instant red flags. The Mercedes had been carefully staged. The driver's seat was pushed all the way back, far too far for either Margaret or Paul, both in their 70s and of short stature. No fingerprints were found from either of them inside. The vehicle had been meticulously wiped down, almost clinically so. There were no personal belongings, no handbag, no wallet, no mobile phone. What had initially looked like a robbery now appeared far more sinister. The positioning of the car, the sterile condition of the interior, the absence of DNA, it all pointed to one thing. This was not a disappearance. This was a cover-up. As forensic teams examined the vehicle, they found trace amounts of blood, enough to suggest injury, but not enough to suggest a struggle inside the car. It was clear the blood had been cleaned up. The Mercedes wasn't the crime scene. It was a prop. Someone had wanted it found. Detective Inspector Andrew Allen made the call to escalate the investigation. The homicide squad mobilised fully. Bazina, now deeply embedded in the case, began coordinating more intensive interviews, digging into timelines and cross-referencing alibis.
It was clearly a deliberate act, a misdirection. That's when the investigation really turned.
As the car was hauled away for deeper forensic testing, the list of persons of interest narrowed. Only one person had been with the couple the night they vanished. Only one had given police a version of events that didn't quite fit with the mounting evidence. They called Matthew back in. He sat down in the interview room, silent, expressionless, detached. When asked to recount the events of April 4th, he repeated his earlier story nearly word for word. It was scripted, and that's what made it suspicious.
There was no emotion. We see it all the time. Someone giving a clean, clear timeline like they're reading from a page. That's when you start to worry.
Detectives began gently challenging the inconsistencies. Why didn't he call his mother the next day when she hadn't checked in? Why hadn't he noticed anything strange when her car went missing? Why were there no fingerprints of Margaret or Paul found in his house? Matthew deflected, repeated, shrugged, but his calm was beginning to crack. Behind the scenes, detectives worked to corroborate his account. Timeline inconsistencies emerged. Witnesses near his home recalled hearing metallic thumps late on April 4th. Security cameras near Middle Park were being reviewed. Forensics on the Mercedes were pending. But in the interview room, it was the absence of emotion that spoke the loudest.
His mother was missing, and yet there was no grief. We weren't accusing him. We were just listening, but he wasn't telling us everything.
The circle was tightening. But there were still no bodies, and without them, there was no proof of murder. The detectives had instinct, suspicion, and a slowly unraveling story. But they needed something physical, something that would put Margaret and Paul into the earth. And Matthew Wales at the center of it. Surveillance on Matthew intensified. His financial records were pulled, his movements scrutinized. What emerged was a trail, thin but unmistakable. On April 5th, the day after the Glen Iris dinner, Matthew had hired a trailer from a local equipment hire business. Staff recalled him as anxious and distracted. He returned the trailer 2 days later. Detectives were immediately suspicious. It was an odd time to be moving furniture or clearing garden waste, especially when his mother and stepfather were missing. From there, the paper trail widened. Credit card records showed he had purchased fuel, including 2 red jerry cans. He'd bought a Melways Street directory from a service station, an unusual item in the age of GPS and online mapping, unless someone was planning to travel off-grid. Later, that same directory would be found, with areas around Marysville marked. At the Glen Iris property, investigators returned to examine the garage more closely. This time, they noticed the smell of bleach. The concrete floor had been scrubbed thoroughly. There were no visible bloodstains, but the efforts to clean told its own story. Neighbours told police they'd seen Matthew loading heavy, long objects wrapped in bedding into the trailer over the Easter weekend. The pieces were coming together. A theory began to take shape. The couple had been murdered in the house, their bodies stored temporarily in the garage, then transported somewhere. Police now turned their attention to the Yarra Ranges and the dense forest beyond Marysville. The bushland was vast, remote, and treacherous in parts. Search teams combed through walking tracks, fire trails, logging roads. Still nothing turned up, until a twist of fate intervened. April 29th. A forestry worker on a routine patrol just outside Marysville noticed something unusual. A patch of earth beside a remote walking track that didn't look natural. The soil was freshly disturbed. As he moved closer, a pungent smell hit him. He called it in. Police arrived within hours. They began digging. There, just beneath the surface, they uncovered a shallow grave. Inside were 2 bodies, wrapped tightly in bedding and weighed down with concrete blocks. One was significantly heavier than the other. Both were in an advanced stage of decomposition. Forensics confirmed what detectives already feared. It was Margaret Wales King and Paul King. Margaret had suffered severe blunt force trauma to the back of her skull, so violent it had fractured her skull in multiple places. Paul had similar injuries, but his autopsy revealed something else. He had also been strangled, with a plastic bag over his head and an electrical cord around his neck. The investigators' theory had proven chillingly accurate. The couple had likely been killed shortly after dinner on April 4th. Their bodies were stored in the Glen Iris garage for several days. Then, using the hired trailer, Matthew had transported them under the cover of night and buried them in the bush. Detectives now had nearly everything they needed: a timeline, forensic evidence, a motive rooted in family resentment and inheritance. And at the center of it all, the man who had lied to their faces in the earliest hours of the investigation, Margaret's own son.
Want to experience more Australian stories?
Meredith's men tried everything from ambushes to moving patrols. They even mounted a machine gun on the back of a truck. The plan? Drive alongside the birds and mow them down in motion. It was chaos. The truck couldn't keep up.
Listen to Australian history stories. New episode every week.
May 11th. Detectives from the homicide squad had prepared meticulously. After weeks of surveillance, forensic work, and analysis, they were ready to bring in their suspect. This wasn't just about accusation. It was about confirmation. They wanted to watch him react. They wanted to hear what he would say when the full weight of the case was laid bare before him. Matthew Wales was called to the police station under the pretext of assisting further with inquiries. He arrived calmly, dressed conservatively, unassuming. As he stepped into the sterile, windowless interview room at St Kilda Road Police Complex, the gravity of the situation hadn't yet touched him, or so it seemed. Detective Sergeant Charlie Bazina and his partner led the interview. As the detectives laid out what they had, trailer hire, fuel logs, bleach-cleaned concrete, staged vehicle dump and a shallow grave in Marysville, Matthew sat in silence for some time. And then he spoke.
I did it. I killed them. My head was just going bananas and I just kept on hitting.
No dramatics, no emotion, just a quiet admission that confirmed what police already suspected. From there, he described the murders in chilling detail, and as he talked, the picture became clear. April 4th, 2002. It was a mild Thursday evening in Melbourne. In the leafy suburb of Glen Iris, nestled among quiet, tree-lined streets and comfortable family homes, Margaret Wales King and her husband Paul King were heading out for dinner. The invitation had come from Margaret's son, Matthew Wales, and his wife Maritza. A relaxed family evening, but behind the invitation was a plan that had been forming in Matthew's mind for weeks. A plan to kill his mother and stepfather, one born not in sudden rage, but in decades of resentment, humiliation, and a deep-seated belief that he had been controlled his entire life. Margaret and Paul pulled up in their silver Mercedes-Benz, parking outside Matthew and Maritza's modest suburban home. Inside, Maritza greeted them warmly. The dinner table was set. Matthew, by all accounts, appeared calm. He had prepared a 3-course meal, acting like any dutiful son hosting his mother. The couple settled in. There was wine, conversation, nothing to suggest what was to come. But Matthew had already crushed and dissolved temazepam, a prescription sleeping medication, into the dessert, possibly the soup. It's never been confirmed which dish, but what's known is that Margaret and Paul both consumed it without hesitation. As the evening wore on, Margaret and Paul began to appear drowsy. Their reactions slowed, their speech slurred. The sedative was strong, powerful enough to render both unconscious within a short window. Once they were asleep, perhaps in chairs or moved to another room, Matthew waited. He made sure they were deeply sedated. Then he retrieved a length of copper pipe he had prepared in advance. Matthew struck Margaret first, several times to the head. She died either instantly or within moments. Paul King, still unconscious or semi-conscious, was struck next. But the blows didn't kill him, so Matthew took a plastic bag, slipped it over Paul's head, and sealed it with adhesive tape. Paul suffocated in silence. 2 lives extinguished, no struggle, no shouts, just methodical violence, carried out with chilling precision. With both bodies dead in his home, Matthew set about cleaning. He wrapped Margaret and Paul in doonas, plastic sheeting and towels, items from his own linen cupboard. He cleaned the blood, the garage floor, the dining area. The garage became a temporary makeshift morgue where the bodies were stored for days. Maritza was present in the house that night, but whether she knew what had happened immediately remains unclear. She later admitted to not asking questions, despite Matthew's strange, obsessive cleaning. That weekend, Maritza and the couple's young son left for an Easter trip, giving Matthew the time and space to complete the next phase of his plan: disposal. The following day, Matthew hired a box trailer from a local rental yard. He loaded the bodies into the trailer and, in the early hours of Saturday, April 6th, drove out of Melbourne, heading northeast to a remote stretch of bushland near Marysville. Off a small dirt road near the Yarra Ranges National Park, he dug a shallow grave. He placed both bodies inside, covered them with soil and laid concrete blocks on top, possibly from his own garage, intended to keep animals away or to slow down any potential discovery. He then drove back to Melbourne, abandoning the Mercedes-Benz in Middle Park, carefully parking it to look like the couple had gone missing during a routine outing. By Sunday, April 7th, Matthew Wales had murdered, concealed and staged the disappearance of his mother and stepfather. Matthew explained that his motive was not sudden or impulsive, but the result of long festering emotions. He believed his mother, Margaret Wales King, had exerted control over every aspect of his life. Emotionally, she had sidelined him. Financially, he felt manipulated and diminished. Socially, he claimed she had turned family members against him, especially his half-siblings. Despite being the oldest child, he said he was treated as though his voice held no weight, his presence no value. The tipping point, in his mind, was the growing influence of Paul King, Margaret's second husband. Matthew believed Paul had replaced him not just in Margaret's affections, but in her legacy. Detectives later noted that Matthew saw Margaret's updated will as a final betrayal. Paul King's growing influence in Margaret's life, and by extension, in her estate, made Matthew feel like an outsider. In his confession, he never stated that the murders were about gaining a larger inheritance, but rather about taking back control from a woman he saw as having dominated and diminished him his entire life. He spoke of being alienated within his own family, infantilized as an adult, and humiliated by the sense that he would never be free of his mother's control. This was no outburst of rage. The murder was planned, carefully, coldly, the culmination of years of internalized resentment that had evolved into a calculated act of violence. And as he sat across from the detectives and laid it all out, his tone didn't change. When asked how he felt in the moments after the killings, he simply said,
I felt relief, like something had lifted.
After his arrest and full confession, Matthew Wales was formally charged with the murders of his mother, Margaret Wales King, and her husband, Paul King. The case, which had gripped Melbourne with its blend of privilege and brutality, was now headed for court. The trial was set for March 2003 at the County Court of Victoria. The public and the press braced for a lengthy and sensational legal battle, but would be surprised. Matthew pleaded guilty to both murders, an unexpected development that spared the family the anguish of sitting through days of forensic testimony and crime scene reconstructions. His guilty plea was not out of remorse, it seemed, but an acceptance of the inevitable. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Matthew Wales was sentenced to 30 years imprisonment with a non-parole period of 24 years. Though Matthew had acted alone in the killings, attention also turned to his wife, Maritza Wales. Investigators found that she had helped him rent the trailer used to transport the bodies and had failed to alert authorities even after the couple's disappearance became public. For her role in assisting after the fact, Maritza was charged with attempting to pervert the course of justice. The court handed her a 2-year suspended sentence which sparked public controversy. The court accepted that she acted under his emotional control and didn't know about the murders beforehand, but many viewed the sentence as too lenient given the brutality of the crime and her role in the cover-up. For Margaret's other children, the ordeal left emotional scars that would never fully heal. In interviews, they described a mix of grief, disbelief and sorrow, not just over the loss, but over the betrayal from within their own family. Years later, the legacy of the case still lingers. Matthew Wales remains in prison. His young son, Dominic, who had been just a child when the murders occurred, eventually inherited the family estate following a complex legal battle. The case became known as the Society Murders due to Margaret's prominence in social circles. Books and documentaries followed, dissecting the case and its motives. But for the Wales and King families, the aftermath left deep and lasting scars, division, grief, and the permanent loss of 2 lives at the hands of someone they had once loved. To hear more about this case, such as Matthew's psychology, the family dynamics, and whether Maritza had a larger role, listen to Crime Unearthed, The Society Murders, released tomorrow morning. Follow Australian Stories to be notified of new episodes. Thanks for listening to Australian Crime Stories. Want more stories like this one? Listen to our new show Australian History Stories today. You can also support us by subscribing for less than a coffee. You'll become part of the Ned Kelly gang and gain early access to ad-free episodes, as well as exclusive content